Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Joe Sternberg. We're talking about the status of the financial panic and its impact on the economy. And let's listen to Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, talk about what went wrong in the bank supervision last week at his press conference.
For our part, we're doing a review of supervision and regulation. My only interest is that we identify what went wrong here. How did this happen is the question. What went wrong? These are not weaknesses that are at all broadly through the banking system. This was a bank that was an outlier in terms of both its percentage of uninsured deposits and in terms of its holdings of duration risk. And again, supervisors did get in there, and they were, as you know, obviously, they were on this issue, but nonetheless, this still happened.
Well, terribly frustrating answer by Jay Powell, if you ask me, Kim. First of all, the FDIC has said in December that there were $620 billion in duration risk inside the banking system that it had identified. So this bank wasn't only an outlier, okay? Number two, he said supervisors were on it. Oh, okay, well, thanks. Supervisors were on it. Well, did they do anything about it? If not, why not? What did they walk in and say, geez, fellas, you got a little duration risk problem here. Maybe you should do something about it, but hey, we'll go back for the weekend. What is it that examiners are supposed to do and why? I'd like to know to what extent they recognize the problem, what they actually did about it, to the extent that they did identify it, and then why didn't the Silicon Valley Bank people act on it if, in fact, they did identify it. I have zero confidence, less than zero confidence, that this investigation that Jerome Powell has started has got underway with Michael Barr, the vice chairman for supervision, is actually going to get to the bottom of any of this because, as Joe suggests, what the regulators do is they always blame bank management because, of course, the alternative is maybe the regulator screwed up. But instead, what you do is you basically say blame the management, and then the regulators say, oh, not us. And by the way, we need more power to be able to prevent the flawed management that caused it, instead of actually looking inside their failures of regulation and failures of supervision.
Right. It's a little bit like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. And if you look at SVB, we're already starting to get some really eyebrow-raising things that have come out. We now have seen news reports saying that there were problems being flagged at SVB as early as 2019, that more came out last summer. And yet, as you say, no corrective action seems to have been taken. Here's just a little example of what people could have been looking at. SVB disclosed in September that the value of its hold to maturity funds was $15.9 billion less than the balance sheet value. Okay, and that was only slightly less than its total equity, meaning the bank was in some ways technically insolvent at that point, and yet nobody did anything. And you see this, I think there's a particular question that needs to be put on the San Francisco Reserve, given the number of Western banks that we've seen that have been having trouble here, SVB, Silvergate, First Republic, PacWest. And, we've run some really good editorials about this, asking whether or not one of the things that regulators were doing here were focusing on all the wrong kind of risks. You see some memos that were coming out of the Fed talking about their obsession with climate change and financial fairness and the Community Reinvestment Act. And yet no one seems to have been looking at the very real risks out there of rising interest rates and other things that ultimately were the cause of these banks' failures. So there's a lot to be asked, but I have no confidence, along with you, that this is going to be done by Michael Barr or anyone else at the Fed in a way that actually gets to the bottom of this.
The point about the potential misplaced priorities is, I think, an important one because, as we all know in life, there are limited amounts of time. There are limited amounts of focus that any individual or any institution can have. And the central mandate for the Fed in terms of supervision of the banking system is make sure it's sound and safe. And yet what's happened is that the bank Federal Reserve Bank of Washington, drove through the regional banks, and particularly active at the San Francisco Fed was President Mary Daly, driving a message about climate change, about social equity and other things. Now, I don't think that that's the reason SVB failed. It failed because of its duration risk problem and the mistakes of not hedging and so on. But from an examiner point of view and from a regulatory priority point of view, what were they looking at? What were they stressing? Why weren't they looking at the duration risk as opposed to focusing on things like climate and other things, Joe?
Exactly. And I think that it's important to remember when we have this conversation that bank examiners are human beings as well. And particularly they are people who operate within a certain kind of bureaucracy. And so there are always incentives that operate within that kind of system. And so if you are a bank examiner who's getting the message from above you in the food chain that, what people are really interested in is all of the, social justice stuff or the environmental risk management or that kind of thing, that naturally is sending you a very strong signal about how you need to be spending your limited number of hours each day, as you are going about your supervisory functions. And the other important problem this creates is that I think that we all would benefit from having a certain amount of, imagination or mental creativity on the part of bank examiners to be able to look at the institutions that they're overseeing, look at the broader economic environment and think, well, what are the risks that could be developing here that we aren't really thinking enough about yet? And if you've created this bureaucratic edifice around those examiners where they worry that they are not going to be rewarded by their bosses for saying, hey, maybe we need to be paying more attention about interest rate risk at this bank, even though they do a lot of the, kinds of lending that we want to encourage, you're not going to get the kind of supervision that you want. So I think that, this has an awful lot to do with the bureaucratic incentives for the people who work in those offices, and that should really be part of this picture too.
Couldn't agree more, Joe. Let's talk a little bit before we go about the implications of this for the economy. There's no question that when you have a financial panic like this, what happens is you run the risk of a credit crunch, right? So a lot of deposits are fleeing banks. They're fleeing to money market funds and other sources of supposed safety. And banks are much less willing to lend because they don't want to take risks. One of the things that some bank people are worried about is later this year, you'll take the duration risk problem, and even if that settles down, you could end up with a credit risk problem, particularly in commercial real estate and some other loans that banks have made, these mid-sized banks. So you run the risk that now you get a credit crunch, and that, of course, does tend to slow growth. And Neil Kashkari, the head of the Minneapolis Fed, said as much on the airwaves this weekend. My friend Ed Hyman of Evercore Advisors, a Wall Street financial analyst firm, has baked into his estimates a recession for later this year. I've learned my lesson. I don't make predictions about recessions, but it does seem to me, Kim, this increases the risk of an economic downturn. And you have the dilemma that Jerome Powell has, which is when you have a financial panic, previous Fed presidents have tended to ease monetary policy. But he's got this big inflation hangover, and so he can't easily do what Alan Greenspan did in 1987, 1997, 1998, and then, of course, Ben Bernanke did in 2009 and 10.
Yeah, he's in a real pickle. And, there's plenty of blame to go around here. Powell, as we have said many times, didn't raise rates when there was some pretty strong evidence that it should have been done a lot sooner than it did. But it's funny, I was thinking if I were Jerome Powell, I'd be feeling pretty bitter right now, too, about the Biden White House, which has played its own substantial role in getting us to this now quandary, in that obviously all the money that the Washington, D.C. Democrats were flowing out the door as part of their agenda has fed into that inflation and helped put Powell into the situation he is now. And then you add to this as well some big questions, which I hope get asked this week at these hearings that we're going to have in front of the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee. There's going to be a lot of attention focused on the Fed, but I'm kind of hoping that some of the Republicans, at least in the House Financial Services Committee, spare a little bit of time looking at the failures here, as well as the Biden Financial Stability Oversight Council.
Really good point, Kim. Really good point.
There's going to be a lot of people trying to blame this all on Fed and the lack of Fed supervision and everything. But, this organization, this body, heads of different agencies, was created as part of Dodd-Frank back in 2010. I was looking back at that law. It made me laugh. One of its first provisions was that this oversight council's job was to make sure that everyone understood going forward that no entity was too big to fail. So I think we can all acknowledge that they didn't stand up to that part of their mission very well, given what we're talking about on this. So I'd really like to see some of that attention. And also, even after having failed to see any of this risk, the ways in which they have now engaged in handling these failed banks, which seem to go against some of, again, the prescribed remedies laid out in Dodd-Frank in terms of orderly liquidation, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of blame to be going around here. And I just hope that the officials that we're talking about, FDIC, Treasury, are also getting a little bit of the heat.
I think that's where the focus needs to be, on the failure of bank supervision and the failure of the architecture of bank regulatory reform, financial reform coming out of the crisis of 2008 and 9, because that was supposed to solve these problems. And of course, they haven't. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kim. And thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch, and we'll be back tomorrow following the human comedy that is American politics. Thanks for listening.